Just like really low levels of radiation can be used for imaging in the body, we can also use high levels of radiation. So some radioactive substances in the environment can actually harm cells. They can damage DNA. They can cause cancer. So high levels of radiation would be like overexposure to sunlight. However, we can use this to our advantage. Effective method, high levels of radiation can be an incredibly effective method for sterilizing medical and dental products, mail, and packages. Can be used for sterilizing food. Here's an example of food that has been irradiated or exposed to high levels of UV radiation. It effectively kills bacteria and organisms and pathogens found on the outside or on the surface. UV radiation is how we sterilized equipment in our lab when I was in college or in grad school. In one lab, we were dealing with bacteria and proteins. So we sterilized everything using bleach because our primary subject was E. coli, and we just didn't really need to be all that careful. We just were growing it for the production of proteins, a process I'm going to talk about quite extensively in chapter 14. However, there was another lab where I actually cared about the health and well-being of my bacterial colonies that I was cultivating. And in those cases, I needed to maintain a high level of sterilization without any harmful chemicals or residues that could potentially damage the cells that I was dealing with. In those cases, when we cleaned out our hood, we turned on a UV light. This would blanket sterilize everything in the hood, all equipment, because that high levels of radiation would kill any living organism. Now, granted, I wasn't trying to kill off my bacterial colonies. I was just sterilizing all of my equipment and instrumentation. We can also use high levels of radiation to target and kill cancer cells. This is a very common strategy. Chemotherapy has been used. That's where we use chemicals to try and kill off cancer cells, but we can also use high levels of radiation as well. What we have here is a portion of the periodic table. So to continue our discussion of elements or discussion of atoms, we can compile, or we put everything we know about atoms in the different types of elements on the periodic table. So once chemists began exploring the different types of elements, they noted that while each element has unique properties, there are specific traits and trends that were reoccurring. So this periodic table is a way to organize all of that information and to analyze those trends in a helpful manner. So what you're seeing here is just a portion of the periodic table, but it is the most relevant portion for our purposes in this class. So the periodic table was developed by the Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev as a way to group and categorize the elements by those characteristics. So this is, like I said, it's just a small portion of the periodic table to help us understand how it's organized. Atoms of an element are going to be arranged horizontally by increasing atomic number in rows called periods. So when you're looking at a row of the periodic table, we use the terminology period. So the first period, second period, third period, fourth period, so on and so forth. These are going to be arranged according to atomic number. Atomic number is going to be found right up here above the atomic symbol. The atomic mass is going to be found just below. So the atomic number for hydrogen is going to be 1, meaning that there is 1 proton found in the nucleus of a hydrogen atom. Helium has 2 protons, so it's found over here. Lithium has 3, beryllium 4, boron 5, carbon 6, so on across the periodic table. Atoms of an element can be arranged in vertical columns called groups. Atoms within the same group share very similar characteristics. They're not identical. Every atom has its own unique properties, but atoms found in the same group are going to have similar characteristics, specifically their similar reactivities. For example, group 8 over here, these atoms over here are going to be chemically inert, meaning that they rarely, if ever, interact or react to other atoms. So helium, neon, argon, krypton, they're all examples of these inert atoms, also known as noble gases. Again, this just means that they do not react with other atoms around them. So the atoms that are shown in the periodic table are going to be electrically neutral. Therefore, the atomic number tells you the number of electrons as well as the number of protons. Because of an atom is electrically neutral, let's take oxygen, for example. If the atomic number is 8, that means we have 8 protons. 8 protons means we have 8 positive charges. And if we have an electrically neutral atom, that means the total charge is 0. So if we have 8 positive charges, we must have 8 negative charges. So that's going to be our periodic table. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of an atom and how the electron arrangement relates to its energy. So it's not possible to determine the precise location of an individual electron at any given moment. So we have to have a model that approximates where those electrons are going to be distributed. What we have here is what's known as the Bohr model. This is one of the more common models. It was developed by a physicist named Niels Bohr. In the Bohr model, the electron shells about the nucleus are going to represent the average energy of the energy levels of an electron. So the negatively charged electrons are going to be attracted to the positively charged nucleus. There's an electric attraction between the positive charges here and the negative charges here. It's going to take energy to push them away and keep them in their own shells. So the more distant the shell is, the more energy it takes. Thus, we describe the electrons being at different particular energy levels in relation to the nucleus. So the electrons that are farther away from the nucleus are going to be higher energy. The electrons that are closer to the nucleus are going to be lower energy. Electrons have energy due to their relative position or their potential energy. And electrons are going to be able to move from one energy level to the next energy level. In the process of photosynthesis, when atoms absorb energy from the sun, the electrons are actually going to be boosted to a higher energy level in order to store that energy as potential energy. As they return back down, they're going to relax back down to their original energy shell, their original energy level. They can release that excess pent-up energy and transfer it to a form of chemical energy. And we're going to talk about that quite extensively in our chapter on photosynthesis. But here we're going to look at the distribution of electrons. So this is just a more detailed look at the Bohr's model. For atoms with atomic numbers of 20 or less, and essentially, I'm going to just tell you right now, we're not going to look at any atoms that have an atomic number of larger than 20. So the following rules apply for every atom we're going to talk about in this class. The first energy shell can hold up to 2 electrons. Each additional energy shell can hold up to 8 electrons. Each lower shell must be filled before electrons can be placed in the next shell. So for example, hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, so it has 1 proton. Therefore, how many electrons does it have? 1. So if we have 1 proton, 1 positive charge, we must have 1 electron or 1 negative charge. So hydrogen has 1 lonely little electron. He's going to hang out in the first energy shell because that's the only energy shell. Carbon, on the other hand, carbon has an atomic number of 6, meaning that he has 6 protons or 6 positive charges, so he must have 6 negative charges. So if he has 6 protons, he has 6 electrons. Now, how many electrons can we fit in the very first energy shell? The first energy shell, rule number 1, the first energy shell can hold up to 2 electrons. So we can put 2 electrons in this first energy shell. So we started off with 6 electrons. We put 2 in this first energy shell. So how many electrons do we have left? 4. We have 4 electrons remaining. Now, and each additional shell can hold up to 8 electrons. We only have 4. This energy shell, this next energy shell can hold 8. We only have 4. So we're going to put 4 electrons in this energy shell. So carbon has an atomic number of 6. Thus it has 6 protons. It has 6 electrons. Those 6 electrons are going to be distributed between 2 energy shells. 2 electrons in the first energy shell, 4 electrons in the next energy shell. Sulfur, on the other hand, is going to be a bit larger. Sulfur has an atomic number of 16. So if we have an atomic number of 16, that means we have how many protons? Yeah. We're going to start off, here's an example. So sulfur has an atomic number of 16. So how many protons do we have? 16. How many electrons do we have if we are electrically neutral? 16, because our protons, our positive charges, have to match our electrons, our negative charges. So if we have 16 electrons, how many electrons can go in the first energy shell? The answer is 2, because remember, the first energy shell can only hold up to 2 electrons. So we can put 2 electrons in the first shell. So we started with 16. We put 2 electrons in the first shell. How many electrons do we have left? Yeah, we have 14 electrons left. How many electrons can go in the second energy shell? Well, according to rule number 2, each additional shell can hold up to 8 electrons. So the very next shell is going to have 8 electrons. So we started off with 2. Now we're going to add 8 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 8 electrons in the next shell. Okay, so how many electrons do we have left? We have 2 in the first shell. We have 8 in the second shell. That's 10 out of 16. We started off with 16 electrons. We've already placed 10, so we have 6 more to place. So how many electrons in the third energy shell? The outermost shell, or the third shell, is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 electrons left. The outermost shell is going to be what's known as the valence shell. So you can think of, and that doesn't matter whether you have, if you only have 1 energy shell, then that energy shell is the valence shell. If you have 2, then that energy shell is the valence shell. If you have 16 energy shells, the outermost shell is the valence shell. So the outermost shell, this outermost layer, is always going to be what's known as the valence shell. And we're going to talk about the significance of that valence shell in our next section. Well, we'll mention it a little bit now. The valence shell is going to be the outermost shell of the atom. Now, the reason that we care about this is because this is what's going to determine the atom's properties. Now, I know that we said that the protons determine the chemicals properties, and they do. But the reason why protons determine the chemical properties is because protons determine the number of electrons. And the number of electrons determines the number of electrons in the valence shell. And this valence shell, this is what interacts with other atoms. When you have 2 hydrogen atoms bonding to an oxygen atom to form water, you don't have nucleuses touching up against each other. Remember, we said that atoms are mostly outer space, or mostly empty space. This outermost shell is the only one who gets to make friends. These electrons that are found in the outermost shell are the only ones that are going to interact with or react with other atoms. So the atoms that are, or the electrons that are found in this outermost shell, this valence shell, are extremely important, and they're going to be responsible for all of the bonding. So that outermost shell is going to be our valence shell. The electrons found there are going to be what are known as the valence electrons. And so we're going to mention just briefly what we have when we talk about valence electrons. We have what is known as the octet rule. The octet rule states that valence shells are going to be most stable when they are completely full. So let me say that again. The atom is going to be most stable when the valence shell is completely full. And if you remember, we said that that very first energy shell, the first energy shell can hold up to 2 electrons. So if we only have 1 energy shell, it's going to be the most stable and most happy if it's completely full. This second shell is only going to be happy if it's completely full. So that octet rule says that the valence shell will be most stable with 8 electrons in it, because this outermost shell, it's not the first energy shell, any shell after the first shell, is going to require 8 electrons. So the exception being that the atoms with only 1 energy shell are stable with 2 electrons. But the octet rule basically says that every single atom out there wants to have a full valence shell. He wants to be stable, he wants to be happy. And the way he's going to do that is by pairing up with other atoms around him and making deals. He's going to wheel and deal and see if he can make deals to fill up his outermost shell or his valence shell. This is what we call chemical bonding, and it's going to be the star of our next section on compounds and molecules. So please, before you go on, take a moment to review chemical structure. I should be able to give you a portion of the periodic table like you see here and say, hey, draw me an atom of aluminum. Aluminum has an atomic number of 13 and it's found on the periodic table. You should be able to look at this periodic table